Hi, Stella.
Hi, Kelly. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. What have you got there?
What have I got here? I have got some things to show you, some stories to tell you. First, welcome to Huayet. Hello, Deborah. I wanted to do this to share with the students in Deborah's class. It's always important to talk about things, and these are visuals that actually give you a better understanding of things we're talking about, places we're talking about. Bamfield is right up here. We are going to a place out along here called Kiixin. This is a map that shows the traditional territory for Huayet First Nations. My grandpa used to say that the traditional territory went from Suziet Falls over here. That's like 25 kilometers down the West Coast Trail. You follow the Pella Mountain Range and you come out through Coleman Creek. You go down through Alberni Canal, go around the Deer Group Islands through Junction Pass, up past Edward King. That's this island here. Or Sardis Island, I should say, sorry. And then you go down. Oh, that actually might be Effingham. I might have my islands mixed up. But you go through Junction Pass, you go around Deer Group Islands, you go 200 miles offshore and back to Suziet. And that was once a traditional territory for Huayet First Nations. We come from Barkley Sound area here. My grandfather used to say that there are 5 First Nations within the Barkley Sound area. That is people from Eculet, Tocourt, the 2 First Nations from Port Alberni, the T-Shot, and Hupichicit. 6 First Nations. And the people from Kildonan. They are up the canal here a bit. And us, Huayet. So that's the 6 First Nations. Because we had shared common area, got to gather a lot of resources in that particular area. We also come from the New Channel First Nations, which were the 14 First Nations along the west coast of Vancouver Island. There used to actually be, I say 18 of them, but I was thinking about it, and I think it's actually 16 of them. Because when we talk about the 14 First Nations, there's 2 First Nations we talk about, the Mowicit Muchalat and the Cayucit Checklissit. And those 2 First Nations are actually 2 First Nations that joined together, both groups. So that's an additional 2 extra within this, the New Channel. And another one that used to be part of it was the people from Macaw down in Washington. But when the Americans put in the American border, that separated the people from Macaw from the New Channel. So they were no longer part of the group. They were Americans, were Canadians, and that's what separated them. Until about maybe 26, 28 years ago, one of the elders had spoken up at a New Channel meeting and said that the people from Macaw are actually part of this group. And so I think that's what started this whole canoe journeys, tribal journeys that happen every year. They were the very first ones to get in their canoes, paddle up to Vancouver Island, go to each First Nations territory and invite them down to their place for a gathering, for a traditional gathering. Kind of like a potlatch. It's just a celebration, a ceremony type thing. And so that's what they were doing. And so they were the ones that host the tribal journeys that first year. And then the next year somebody said, well, we want to host it. And so that's what started it. Some First Nation will host the tribal journeys, and it's something that goes on every year. It was supposed to go on in Nanaimo this year, but because of the COVID, it didn't happen. So I'm not too sure what's going to happen with it next year. So, and this map also shows traditional place names. I don't speak the language, so I'm not fluent about a lot of the names. But they're like little areas where they would have utilized for resource gathering. Kiixin Bay is right here, and that's where I live. We have 7 traditional hereditary chiefs in our nation. And so we have one Thai, one head chief. So the Thai is the one that basically owns everything. The other chiefs were designated in specific areas because there was a lot of area to look after, a lot of resources to manage, and so it was basically to help look after all the resources. And so they kind of work together. They work together more so today, even today they do. The federal government came along one day and they said to First Nations that we don't need all of this land. And so what had happened was they had taken away traditional territories from all the First Nations. My grandfather put together a map one time of Vancouver Island, the west coast, and it shows all the way from Port Renfrew, Pacheedaht First Nations, all the way up to Kiixin. And so it shows each First Nations and their traditional territory. And so when the federal government came in, I think it was 1874, they said that you don't need all that land, we're going to take it and we're going to give you little reservations instead. So we ended up with 13 little pocket reserves. I'll just kind of roughly point them out in areas where they are. A couple there. And so going from owning this to actually just a little, maybe 2% of the traditional territory, if that, is quite a change for them. And back then, they were so strict on First Nations. Well, they referred to us as Indians then, and the Indians weren't allowed to leave the land, their reservations, without a permit. They couldn't go hunting or fishing without a permit. They couldn't go and cut a tree down to carve a canoe or to, make their traditional houses or things like that. There was just so many restrictions and stipulations for them. They went and got kids from these small communities, the reservations where they lived in, and they took kids from the ages of 4 to 17. And this started in 1876, I think it was, up until 1996. And so what they were doing was they were taking these kids from these communities and putting them into what they called residential schools at the time. The residential schools were run by the Protestant and Catholic churches, I believe. And so the kids that were removed from their homes, put into these institutions where they went to school there, they lived there. They were restricted from, brothers and sisters couldn't see each other. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to sing their songs. They didn't see their family very often. And so it had to be really hard because it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is. You learn to understand the language, the songs, everything about your family, basically your culture when you're very little. And so by the time you start speaking, you're starting to learn your language, learn your songs. And it had to be really hard for kids, especially between the ages of, I'll say between 10 and even 9, 8 years old, after speaking that language for a few years. And then all of a sudden you got to stop. You're not allowed to speak that no more. If you get caught speaking your language, you get strapped because they wanted you to speak English. They wanted to change the way you were. We did a research project and we came across a document that said that we need to take the Indian out of that boy. We need to change the way he speaks, the way he looks. We don't want him practicing any of his culture because it's not right. They shouldn't be doing that. And so, there was a lot of that went on, especially in the residential schools. The kids that went through residential school too, they went through so much abuse. They went through physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was something that they lived through for the time that they were there. So that had to be really hard for them. Growing up in a family where you have grandparents, parents, and kids all living together in a traditional longhouse, a big house, where there's nothing but unconditional love. The grandparents are there to help those young parents. They're mentors for them to show them how to raise a family properly. how to be good parents, how to teach them things that they need to learn, just in life in general. And then all of a sudden being put in a place where things are so different and they're being mistreated. And, not everybody was mistreated in residential school, but I will say there was a lot of them. During that time in residential school, they said that over 600,000 kids in First Nations kids had died in residential school between that time, which was probably just over a century. So, that's a lot of kids. And the abuse that they went through is something that they learn. Kids are impressionable. And so, having somebody abuse you in whatever way over and over again, they tend to think that's the way things are and that's how it should be and that's okay. And so for some of them that came out of residential school, it's been so many generations. They talk about the 7 generations and how it's going to take 7 generations for First Nations people to heal, to come over this whole residential school thing. Because a lot of those people that went to residential school, the older generations, they did not talk about what happened to them. They kind of blocked it out and they wouldn't share stories about what happened to them in residential school. They wouldn't talk about, they wouldn't talk about any of their own culture. They didn't want to speak their language because they were told not to in residential school. They didn't want to share songs. A lot of them just kind of put what they knew away, basically, and they wouldn't share that. And so a lot of them that came out of there, they wouldn't share songs or dances with their children or their grandchildren. And so I'd have to say we have at least 2, maybe 3 generations where culture wasn't shared. And because they were afraid of teaching their kids that, and they didn't want them to go through the same thing that they had gone through. And so that's basically the reasoning for that. And some of the ones that went through that abuse, they went home and they did the same thing to their own families. They abused their families physically or verbally or sexually. They abused other people's children because it was something that they went through and they carried. It's all that abuse was not part of the culture. It's not something that was taught to them being at home. And so, that's something that they learned being in residential school. And so it's taken some time for people to actually start talking about what had happened in residential school, start bringing back songs and dances. Even adults who weren't in residential school, if they got caught singing songs or getting together, they would be punished. They would be put in jail. All the regalia were taken away. They went into the First Nations communities, to the reserves, and they took away any drums, any headdresses, any totem poles, any artifacts, anything that they could find that related to First Nations culture. They didn't understand the songs, dances. They see these masks and they're just very different looking, so they probably figured we're some crazy devil worshiper or some silly thing. But what they didn't understand was those masks and the regalia that they used, it related them to who we are as First Nations people, where we come from, and our culture. It related us to the lands, to the wildlife around us. So it was like, it helped identify where people came from, basically. They had their designs on their traditional longhouses. They had what they would call, nowadays, they call it a curtain. And that curtain originated from the traditional longhouses that were built. They had designs on the side of their house or on the front of their house. And it's like a painting of all these different things that relate to that one chief or family or whatever. But that design on the house was actually the same design that they would have had on their traditional drum. And later on, they actually put those designs on their dancing shawls. And they went from having those on, it used to be cedar planks that it was painted on. But they would actually put them onto a canvas. And so they'd have a great big canvas, like a 30, 40-foot canvas that had this big design on. When they do traditional potlatches and all the First Nations get together, a family will hang their curtain up, and then that family will be behind that curtain, and they come out from that curtain, and that's when they dance. And a lot of the First Nations up and down the coast, they recognize that curtain. They know the family that they come from. It's like it's like a family crest, to identify them, right? And that's what that was all about. And it's interesting because one of the elders, when we were at a New Channel meeting one time, one of the elders had gotten and spoken up for the people from Kildonan, just up this way here. They had said that their chief wanted to get their curtain back, and that it was going to cost them $45,000 because it was sold to a private collector. Because when they went and took everything from First Nations people, they either sold them to private collectors or they sold them to other museums. So they profited off all the things that First Nations had. And so the elder had got up and he spoke, and he said that these people from Huchuckwusit wanted to get their curtain back. And as it turned out, they had to pay $45,000, and it was in the Andy Warhol collection. So that's where that came from. The Kiixin place that I'm going to today with Kelly, and that I wish all of you guys were able to see this firsthand, because it gives you a whole different perspective, a good view on First Nations people, our past, our present, our a little bit of our future, where we are today. The people that go to New Channel meetings too, another thing about that I want to mention is that the people from Tofino, they came to a meeting one time and they brought a whole entourage of people. They brought their elders, their chiefs, they brought families, and so we weren't sure what was going to happen, because the 14 First Nations used to get together. They would send their chiefs and elders to these meetings, and they were there to talk about a lot of things, what's going on in their communities, things they need. And they would have a budget meeting every year. And so with their budget meetings, the First Nations, they have to identify specifically what they need for their nation in terms of education, housing, running an office, maintaining the grounds. Everything has to be accounted for, every penny. And so the people that came from Tofino with the big group, we didn't know what they were going to do. We thought maybe they're going to have a celebration, a potlatch, and they're going to invite everybody. But no, what they wanted to do was they spoke up about how in Tofino how they were reminded about this residential school, and it was like a bad thing for them. It brought sadness and pain to a lot of people there. And so what they wanted to do with the old residential school was to tear it down. And so they asked First Nations that were in the group if any of them were willing to give up their housing money that year. And Hueyat was one of 8 that had said, you could have our housing money that year. We don't need to build any houses. We'll wait until next year. It's not that we didn't need the houses. Every First Nations, they grow every year, right? Families grow and they need bigger homes or new families coming in, right? And so we told them that they could have our housing money. So there was 8 First Nations that had said, you can take our housing money. And so what they had done with that money was the people from Taloquia, Tofino, they were able to go home, tear down their old residential school, and to rebuild. And so what they had rebuilt was the Tinwis Hotel, the first phase of it, which was something positive in their life. It was a way for them to generate money. And today, since then they've rebuilt, they've added on, they've done the second phase of the Tinwis Hotel. And now it's a world-known storm watch and destination, and it's a really nice place to see if you ever get the opportunity. But so, that's something that came out of, something good that came out of all of that. I think it's important that people understand about the Tinwis Hotel and really where it originated from, because that was the last residential school that shut down in 1996, and it's really not that far away. And it really wasn't that long ago. So, so I'm going to talk a bit about this place here now, Huayet has done a lot of research. We've done a project that was called Cultural Inventory, where we researched all the information that we could find within our traditional territory that related to us as Huayet First Nations, all the documentation that we could find in any provincial archives. And so we're able to gather documents, maps. We did a traditional use study. We gathered, we even did the census information, so we're able to do genealogy through that. We've done traditional use studies, so we've interviewed a lot of our elders about things that they know. And it's funny because I never really got interviewed by anybody. And people are saying, well, we didn't interview you guys because you don't really know that much because you guys are too young. And it's kind of like, what do you mean? You know, we used to go and collect cedar bark and basket grass and traditional berries or go fishing, you know, or hear stories from our elders. You know, we paid attention. We know quite a bit. But it was funny because they said, no, you guys are too young. You don't really know that much. And I'm saying that I think it's funny because just last year, I got interviewed by a film crew that was hired for our nation. And so I think I talked for, almost 3 days, just rambling on about things I know. But I always say that I know a little about a lot because I've been involved in so many different projects. The cultural inventory, I was part of that. Traditional use study, I got to work on that. And so the traditional use study, interviewing all the people that in our nation that know fishing spots or resource gathering spots or where their grandparents used to go do this or that. And so we ended up with something like 1,200 files of information of all this data that we collected. And we've also done archaeological work. We did, the very first archaeologist came out in 1964. His name was Don Abbott. So we have a photo of him at Kiixin with one of our chiefs. We did archaeological surveying in 1984 and again in 1992, I think it was. And so when we did the archaeological surveying, we surveyed 54 kilometers of shoreline within this area. We found 124 archaeological sites. We found culturally modified trees, which are trees that are harvested that are significant to First Nations, the way they harvest their wood. And in 84, when we were doing the CMT work, a culturally modified tree didn't mean anything to anybody except to the First Nations and to the archaeologists. And so the CMTs, you know, it could be a tree where they've taken the bark off for their basket grass. It could be a tree that they've cut a plank out for part of their building purposes. It could be a tree where they've taken a dugout canoe. You know, just so many different uses. And it's the archaeologist has an eye and they could see when these trees were used for those purposes. And so I think it was mid-90s, I'd have to say, that when we did the CMT work, the archaeologist said, we'll give them temporary numbers. So we found about 60 culturally modified trees within this area. And so we gave them temporary numbers because these were just along the shoreline. We never did any inland surveying. And so those temporary numbers that we gave the CMTs, 1990, I'm going to say 1996, somewhere between 96 and 98, was when all of a sudden the courts recognized CMTs as being significant to First Nations. And so it was actually something that could stand up in court. And it helped us within this area. What was our traditional territory became the TFL 44, the tree farm license. And so a lot of logging companies, especially Macmillan Bloedel was the first one, Weyerhaeuser, Hayes, all the different logging companies that had worked in here. It helped us to protect the older growth trees, the CMTs, from being harvested. And so they weren't allowed to cut culturally modified trees because now they were protected by the province. And so that kind of helped us save the old growth, which is pretty significant, I think, on our part. And very important because there's not really a whole lot left. And another thing that was able to stand up in court was oral histories, because First Nations people, they never ever wrote things down. Everything was passed on from generation to generation. You know, we have genealogy for our chieftainship for our head chief, and Derek right now is our head chief. So for my family, we have 11 generations of genealogy that go back. And so songs and dances that were owned by them, that were passed down verbally from one generation to the next. It was never written down because they never wrote things down. They never had a written language. A lot of times what they did was through their artwork, through their, they did petroglyphs a long time ago. And so the carvings in the stone, you know, it's another way of them documenting things. But so oral histories and CMTs were something that were significant and that would stand up in court. And so it was like, that was like a breakthrough for a lot of First Nations. And I think that was a really good move on the I guess it would have been the Supreme Court that would have done that. But that's really important to us. So as well as doing archaeological work, we've done dendrochronology and core sampling out there. So we're able to date the site. We're able to find out how old the village site is, and the dates that we got, it goes back 5,500 years. And that's just this village site, because we had 5 different locations within this area where we had actual traditional longhouses. And so the longhouses, the one out here, we did not want to do any excavations or because we were worried that if we do an excavation in this area, that it's going to attract people we don't want there, and they're going to be digging and looking for things, right? We did do archaeological work out on a place on Diana Island, and the work that they had done there, I think they did 3 summers out there of doing excavations. And so I think the village out there, I think they found out that that one was close to 6,000 years old too. But the people in T-Shot First Nations from Port Alberni, they've been doing archaeological work every year out in the Broken Group Island here. And their village site, it goes back, they said 8,000 years, but I believe they're at 9,000 years now. And the interesting thing was that they found remains or whatever of a woolly dog. And so a woolly dog, you know, they're not here anymore. It was like something that the First Nations had, and they would utilize the fur almost similar to what people do with sheep wool or llama wool or whatever. But that's what they were doing with the woolly dogs, is that they were using that for, I guess, to make their clothing type thing, would be my guess. I don't even know a whole lot about it, but that would just be my wild guess about that. And so that was pretty interesting. They found a village site just near Victoria, and I'm not even sure which First Nation it is, but their village site is 11,000 years old. Up in Haida Gwaii, their village site, they have one there that's 14,000 years old. So, you know, we've been here for a long time, and it's really cool for them to look at shell middens, because it's like layers and layers of crushed shell, and that gives you dates, and it just keeps going and going. And so it's pretty cool to look at these layers of shell midden and, you know, able to identify how long people have been here. I think that they really need to share about First Nations history, because they don't talk a whole lot about it as much as they should, especially what First Nations have been through in terms of residential school. They need to put this whole story together like we do when we talk about people here, because it's important for them to know about our past, what we've been through. And it's important for them to know that we're still here today, and everything that's happened to us, you know, it's just made us stronger, you know. Our First Nations, we've been trying to negotiate treaty with the federal and provincial governments. It took 4 generations. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my Uncle Spencer, my cousin Derek. And then we finally signed a treaty. So 4 generations of negotiating with BC and Canada, trying to come to a resolution about trying to get some land back, trying to have access to certain things, and to be able to be self-governing. And we knew the treaty, we would never get 100% of our traditional territory back, but for us, it's a tool for us to help make things better for our people, better in our lives. And when we didn't have treaty, being under the Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, INAC is what I say, is that there were so many restrictions. It's just, it's like the residential school all over again. You couldn't do this. You couldn't go harvest a tree. You couldn't go build a house. You couldn't start a business. The budgets that First Nations people applied for, they had to, every cent that they got, it had to go to that thing. They couldn't make any changes and say, oh, well, this thing broke, so we need to replace it. It's like, no, you can't do that. You got to try and get more money. You got to ask for it. And so, very strict in terms of finances. But now we have our own, we can generate our own funds, and we can decide what we need or where we're going to spend the money. We can fall trees within our area now. We can clear land. We can build houses. We have the ability to do a lot of things. We can own businesses now. Without treaty, we wouldn't have been able to purchase. In Bamfield, we've purchased 11 different properties. We've purchased the store, the motel. We've purchased a couple of private properties, which we wouldn't have had the ability to do so if we didn't have our own treaty. And so for us, that's a way to generate funds. We manage the government dock in Bamfield, and so that's another way to generate funds. We've purchased, at first I think it was 7% within the TFL, and so we purchased another 46%, so we're up to 51% of ownership within the TFL. And so we have a lot of say on what goes on within this logging. Mind you, I don't always agree with their logging methods, because I see a lot of logging happening too close to home, too close to the river, but I'm only one voice. But I know my voice is strong, and I can get a lot of people behind me, because we all listen to our elders, and we all understand the importance of what we have around us and how you can't put a price on it. I always say what's in the ocean feeds the rivers, what's in the rivers feeds the lands. What's in the lands, the rivers, the oceans feed the animals, and they feed us. So I think that's about covers that. I think I've covered quite a bit. So I'm going to move on to the next one. This here is an artist's rendering of what the Kiixin village site would have looked like. When we did the archaeological mapping, you could see the 8 houses that are here. 2 welcome figures that came from this village site, which are now in the RBC Museum. There was actually 2 longhouses up on top of that house. And that's a whole other story. Maybe I'll talk about that when we're more in person. But so that's that drawing. This here is the actual archaeological map that we had done. And I believe it's upside down. Nope, that's right. There's the rock there, the Kiixin rock. And there's the 8 houses that were there. And so I believe this house here is the one where those 2 welcome figures came from. This house here, I think, is where the arch is that we're going to see when we get to the village site. This here shows the 2 welcome figures that were actually at the village site. They're 40 feet tall, and they're now in... When they removed them, my grandpa said that one of them actually stood in front of the Hudson Bay store in Vancouver. And they were actually removed from there, and they were brought back together and put in the RBC Museum. So today they are right in the lobby, right in the main entrance there. And through repatriation, through treaty talks, one of the things they talked about was the fact that we had the opportunity to get some artifacts back. And they asked if we wanted these welcome figures back. But the thing was, the 5 First Nations that negotiated treaty were people from Ucluelet, Tocourt, Kildonan, Huayet, us, so Banfield, and up in Cayuga, Checklisset. So the people from up Cayuga, people wonder, well, how the heck did they manage to get in on treaty when you 4 are really close in Barkley Sound and Cayuga's way on the other end of the island? I think that might have something to do with my Uncle Robert, our hereditary chief, because his wife is one of the chiefs from Cayuga. And so I think they jumped on board with us when we started getting closer to negotiating treaty. Because the 14 First Nations, they were trying to negotiate treaty with the federal and provincial governments, but you try and negotiate something where in the Indian Act, it states that you can't have your hereditary government. You have to have elected chief, elected council, because that's what it says in the Indian Act. They have a book called the Indian Act where it tells you it's got so many restrictions, stipulations. Like I mentioned earlier, you can't cut a tree down, you can't build a house, you can't start a business. And our lawyer, he gave me a copy of the Indian Act once, and I used to joke around and I'd say, the Indian Act is a book. I said, it tells us how we're supposed to act like Indians. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that, you gotta do this, you gotta do that, and just so on. I was always joking around that book. But it's true, though, because we weren't allowed to do a whole lot of things. And so, and one of the things in the Indian Act under their elections is that you can't have traditional government. They're not recognized by Canada or BC. You have to have elected chief, elected council, and every 2 years your government's going to change because you have to have an election. And so for Huayet, when all of this got brought on, I believe Huayet did do their election every 2 years. But later on, we changed our election code, and we said that we're going to have an election every 4 years. Because in 2 years, you spend your first half a year trying to figure out where you are, what you're going to do, what your place is. And then you start getting things going, and all of a sudden things change, and you could be out of there, right? Whereas in 4 years, it gives you more time to do what you need to do. And so that was the reasoning why our nation went with 4-year terms on elections. And so having 14 First Nations at a big table, tried to negotiate with BC and Canada, and all of a sudden you got, say, 3 of the 14 groups there, if they have elections that year, their government changes. And so you got brand new people at the table, and they're like, well, I don't know what's going on. I don't know who decided that. We didn't, It's like take 2 steps back, review, and then move forward. And then just when you start making progress, 5 more nations have to vote because they have elections coming. And the same thing, sometimes the governments change, sometimes it's the same. And so it was always move forward a bit, go back, move forward a bit, go back. And so we were going nowhere fast. And so, 4 generations, that was it. It was actually the 3rd generation that our nation decided that we were going to go on our own. His Uncle Spencer, that was part of that. And so, when Derek got in, we were relieved to know that we actually signed a treaty, because Derek didn't have any kids at the time. It's kind of like I said to the guys at BC and Canada, I said, so, we're going to have to sign this treaty really soon because Derek doesn't have any kids, so there's not going to be another generation to go on to. But Derek did eventually have a little girl, Olivia. She will be our next chief one of these days, so which is kind of cool. But yeah, so, that's one of the things that during treaty negotiations that we found out. We look at what happened to us in our past. during treaty negotiations, one of the things we wanted to do was to ensure that what we get in treaty is going to be there for future generations. We're not going to get something and some land, some money, and we're not going to do the right thing, or we're going to have a government that's greedy or, just thinks of their own family kind of thing. We need to think of everybody. We need to think of our members who are off reserve, especially not just the ones at home. Because it's not their fault that we live in an area where there's the three key things that we need to bring people home are housing, jobs, and education. It's not our fault that our school only went to grade 7 at the time. And our kids, they either had to board out or the families moved away, or because there was seasonal jobs. There was logging and fishing, and those were full-time jobs. They were long-term at one time, but things started dwindling down. There wasn't much logging happening. There wasn't much fishing going on. The fishing season, we're lucky to get 1 or 2 commercial openings a year now, whereas before it used to go from April 15th until October 31st. That was the whole commercial fishery, and it was open in Barkley Sound, so they could go out here and fish. Now they got to go all the way up to Cayucit and Zabalas to go do a commercial fishery, so it's kind of crazy. But so things like that, the not much job opportunities, seasonal work here, so people moved away to go get better long-term jobs. They moved away for shortage of housing. There wasn't enough housing for their families. And so those people that had to move away for those whatever reasons, they shouldn't be left out within our treaty. They should be included. They're still Huayet, their roots come from here. So we needed to think of them as well. And so we made sure that we reached out to our citizens away from home. And we have a good majority of them that live down in Washington. So we reached out to our citizens that are scattered all over the place, Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, the mainland. And so we would have meetings with these, they'd all come together, and we'd update them on where we were going with treaty. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to ensure that what we're going to have in treaty is going to be there for future generations. And so what we decided to do was look at the Constitution, the Canadian Constitution. And we developed our own Huayet Constitution. And doing that, the lawyer we had, he was also from the bars of Texas, so he was quite familiar with American treaties and Canadian treaties, and so he knew a lot. And so doing the research, one of the things that we found out, besides this whole smallpox epidemic and residential school, because that did a lot of harm to First Nations people. We lost a lot of people because of those. But it was interesting to find out, like when we were doing the research, we found out that they were actually giving out Hudson Bay blankets to all the Indians on the coast. And so they probably thought it was a nice gesture on their part, nice, they're giving us nice warm blankets, but only to find out they're contaminated with smallpox, and it wiped out a lot of them. Another thing that we found out too was that doing the research for the Constitution was that we actually didn't own the reserve lands. It was only for the use and benefit of Indians. And so it made us think of what would have happened if they really wiped us out during this smallpox and through residential school. And what if they had basically done away with First Nations and our culture? Would the land be reverted back to the Queen and life would go on, another happy day for them, but it just made us think of things like that, When Stephen Point became Lieutenant Governor for BC, he went to the Indigenous Games in Cowichan, and there were 6,000 First Nations athletes there, and they were all gathering because they were all competing. And so Stephen Point got up as a representative for BC, and the first thing he said was, "We're still here." And he was referring to the fact that we as First Nations people were still here. We're not going anywhere. We're stronger than ever, and everything we've been through has just made us stronger. And I thought that was just the coolest thing that he had said. But yeah. So I'm going to get back to this. So yeah, I was talking about artifacts and how they had removed a lot of them and things got sold. And So through repatriation, we did not want to take these great big 40-foot totem poles. We did negotiate some artifacts, and they are in our government office right now. And the thing with the 5 First Nations that negotiated treaty was that we had the opportunity to build a museum within those 5 First Nations, but then it was a whole other decision on where it would be, because Bamfield wouldn't be the ideal location, because you have to have a big facility. It has to be warm storage, cold storage, because of certain artifacts. So would it be in Ucula? Would it be in Cayuga? Would it be in Tofino? You know. So each nation, they just negotiated their bringing home their own artifacts, and so that's what we had done. We actually, these 2 welcome figures, we brought an architect out to the village site one year because we wanted to build our own little cultural center. I say little. The logs in there are 110 feet that go across inside. They actually built 2 welcome figures out in front of the house of Huayet, and they are 20 feet tall. And now that they built this little gazebo, I've been saying that, well, we need welcome figures here too. Can we get 2 10-foot welcome figures out front? Because that would just connect this whole thing, you know, to who we are. It's like a signature, these welcome figures. But we brought the CEO from RBC Museum, Jack Lohman. He came out to the village site, so he knows the history around Kiixin. He knows about the welcome figures, so he knows that connection between Huayet and us and the welcome figures that are in the museum. So that was kind of cool. This one here, it shows the structures of the house. So we had 2 different style houses. So it's got the long shed style and then the peaked style roof. And so this shows how the posts and beams are standing up on top of the logs. And you can see there's a notch up here. And so they would put the log in there so it would kind of fall into place so it wouldn't fall over. So a lot of that, a lot of manpower, a lot of leverage, and a lot of cedar rope is what I'm thinking. And Hilary Stewart, she did a book on cedar, and it shows how they would have lifted a lot of these things. You can see a lot what I mean by a lot of manpower and a lot of cedar rope and leverage to lift things. And I'm sure a lot of trial and error, because I'm sure it took them a while to figure things out when they were doing them. But these structures were so big, you're going to see the size of the posts and beams that are down on the site. Yeah, and I think that's it for what I have to talk about right now.
Thanks, Stella.
Mm-hmm. So this is where I like to stop, because this here is a CMT, culture modified tree. You can tell by the yellow ribbon there, specific. CMT, yellow ribbon. It's nice to see they have their own flagging for this kind of things. But this tree here was harvested up high. You can see they cut the top off. Not sure what this one would have been used for. It could have been used for many reasons. Could have been used for part of their house. It could have been used for paddles. Could have been used for planks. Cedar has many uses, so, and they use them for a lot of things. So I'm not too sure what that would have been. But the interesting thing is, if you look at it, how high it's cut up. But they would have built a plank or a platform, and they would have had the platform up high, and they would have cut up high. And reason being is because you look at a tree and how flared out it is at the bottom. If you go straight to the top where it's the wood that you want, then you're going to save all that time on chopping all that, because it's so much wider at the bottom and you're not even going to use all of that. So it just makes a lot of sense to do it that way. So we do have a couple of culture modified trees along the way. We walked past a couple of cedars here that actually had old bark strips that are healing. You can see the little splits in them. When we were kids, we'd go out with our grandparents and we'd go out and we'd help them take bark off trees. So you look at this tree here and how thin the bark is. What they would do is they would cut a slice at the bottom of it, and then they would like make a little notch so you could pull that bark and pull on it. They would find a tree that's clear. The blue jay's trying to outdo me.
The Stellar Jay wants to talk too.
I think I'm talking to him. But they would take a notch on there, pull the bottom, and the bark would just kind of just taper all the way up, depending on how clear the tree was. No branches in the way, and sometimes they go 20, 30, 40 feet high. And so they would take that bark, peel off the outer bark, and then you end up with bark that's so thick yet. So they just split that, and they would use that.
I don't think he likes your story.
I know. I don't think he likes us here.
Well, he just flew off, but he's contending for master of the forest in here.
He hasn't stopped. I'm trying to call his friends over.
Maybe he thinks we have snacks.
Yeah, but anyway, so they would take that cedar bark and they would split it to whatever thickness they want and however wide they wanted it, depending on what they were going to use it for. Whether they were making baskets or sometimes they would make their shawls out of baskets, basket grass or the cedar bark. They made their traditional hats out of cedar bark. And the cool thing is now you can find a traditional cedar hat. You can get a grad cap, a fedora, a sun cap, a baseball cap. You name it, they can make it out of cedar now, and they look really cool. Yeah. Yeah, so, and just up here too, there's another stump here. It's got the ribbon on it. So that's another culturally modified stump. And this is what a rainforest is supposed to look like. You know, it's not trees where it's tree here, tree here, tree there, tree here. And they're all spaced apart evenly. The rainforest is trees of various sizes, various species, and there's trees that are dead on the ground that their purpose for them now is for vegetation to grow on top of them, or other trees are growing on top of them. You can see the vegetation growing on top of the CMT, so yeah, this is the way it's supposed to be. But we're gonna carry on, and hopefully you can fill in this little CMT here, Kelly, get the ribbon on of that so they can see that. Yeah, so that one they've actually cut that whole tree down too. So they you know, they could have used it in their traditional longhouses for a post or possibly beams or something like that. Yep. So right here we have another CMT. You can see the nice yellow ribbon there, culturally modified tree. This big cedar here, probably about 600 years old, rough guess. You can see the chop marks in there. And so they're like adze marks on there. If you zoom in close, you can see the marks. And the interesting thing is that with chop marks is you can tell if they use the metal tool or if they use stone or bone. Because if they had used metal, the wood would have turned black. Something to do with the chemical reaction with the metal and the wood. But so I'm not too sure whether they used stone or bone, because that's pretty wide chop marks on this. And this tree here, it looks like what is a test hole for whether or not they would have used it for a canoe. If they would have used this for a canoe, they obviously didn't. And it's interesting because the tree still grows. Mind you, when they took planks off trees, they did it all, took them from living trees, and the trees still continued to live. When they take cedar bark off trees, the trees will heal themselves. And so, like the way you see those little lobes going around, you can tell a CMT where they've taken the bark strip off because of you put your hand on the side of them, and if your fingers can go into the lobe, then that's where it's a bark strip. But if it's more natural, your hands are just kind of like flush around them. So it's that where you can put your fingers in there. You can tell the difference between a CMT and not. So that's pretty interesting. But so if they were to use this as a canoe, what they would have done is they would have fallen the tree right here. They would have carved their canoe here. They would have come back every day and carved until they finished it. And then once it was completed, what they would have done was they would have taken smaller logs, rolled the canoe onto the logs, and they would have used that and rolled the canoe to the shoreline, because it's a whole lot easier to move a canoe than it is to move a tree, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're getting close to the village site now. We actually have these signs on site. It's got the drawings of the 2 welcome figures, and those 2 drawings are actually the same ones that we have in front of our cultural center. So they look a little different than the one in the actual photograph that you had seen. But this says Kiixin. Kiixin is the traditional capital of the Huayet First Nation. It is the property of Huayet Tai Hatwia, hereditary chief Kiixin. Huayet history at Kiixin stretches back thousands of years. It is a National Historic Site of Canada. Oh yeah, that's what I forgot to mention. We did do work and had this designated as a National Historic Site. Entering without a guide is illegal. Extremely fragile Huayet heritage could be unknowingly damaged by trespassers. Thank you for respecting Kiixin Chief Kiixin and the Huayet. And just on that note about the National Historic Site, I went with my Uncle Spencer, our Tai, our hereditary chief, and my Uncle Robert, our elected chief, and his wife Sarah. We went to Ottawa to do a presentation to the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board to try to get this place designated as a National Historic Site. A couple of years before, we actually brought George MacDonald out here, and he used to work for Parks Canada, but he was also sitting on the National Historic Sites Board. And so it was like a shoe-in for us because he had been here, he knew a bit about Huayet, and so I think that kind of helped us get to where we wanted to be. But the interesting thing was when we were in Ottawa, we had a couple days to spare. And so they said, do you want to go to the Museum of Civilization? And both my uncles and my Auntie Sarah said, yeah, okay. And I go, no. And they're like, well, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go to the museum, but I want to go to the archives, to the downstairs, the basement where nothing's ever shown. And they kind of looked at me. And I said, I want to see what kind of artifacts are down there that you guys haven't cataloged yet. Because doing research, the cultural inventory, that's what we spend a lot of our time doing in museums. And so I wanted to see what the Museum of Civilization had. I was pretty thrown back by the amount of artifacts that are in that building, because it is such a large museum. And the artifacts, it's like shelves that are, I don't know how high, but it's like big containers. They're like huge, and they're full of First Nations artifacts. It's like boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes stacked, 8 boxes are like, shelves are like that high. And there's probably like 8-10 shelves high. And it just goes on, and all those artifacts, they are all collections from, say, BC, but they're all thrown into one box. So it doesn't matter if it was Huayet from Bamfield, if it was, the people from Mission, from Bella Bella, from Queen Charlotte's, they're all thrown in the same box. And so you can't tell where that actually came from. And so, with this whole residential school, and we had that 1 or 2 generations where people didn't talk about, they didn't share anything. So we have a gap in identifying artifacts. That's what I think anyways. But so, when we did the archaeological work, the linguistics, because we had to fill out these forms for the province, the linguistics that they wrote was Waukeshan for First Nations people. And then from Waukeshan, the language changed to Nootka later on. And it eventually became Nuu-chah-nulth. But so that's what they did with the museums. Everything's labeled Nootka. So whether it's Nootka or from Vancouver Island, you don't know. And so there's no way of actually identifying a lot of those things. But I was pretty surprised at how many artifacts were just in boxes and boxes. And there's no way, like First Nations, because that generation is no longer there to help identify, to that would have passed on that knowledge to share, you know, what kind of artifacts belong to them. There's that loss there, right? So it'd be really hard to identify that kind of thing. But so yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I did kind of forget to mention the designation of the National Historic Site. Yeah. Okay, so we are going to walk into one of the first houses on the site. You can see this log here is actually a beam. This post right there. There's another corner post at the other end. Another post here. We've got a path going in there. We've laid out oyster shells. We try to stay within the oyster shells so people aren't kind of wandering around and impacting the site too much. But I'll tell you a little bit more once we get in. One of the things I like to let people know is that when you're looking in here, you can see all these trees growing up, and they're actually nursing trees that are growing on top of posts or beams. You can see the vegetation growing on this post here. And the houses were pretty close together. There's actually a post that's inside this tree here. You know, we say what we take from the earth goes back to the earth, so it's a fine example. You can see that almost the four corners where the roots kind of grew on this tree here, and it just grew and grew and grew until it totally covered the whole thing. So that's a fine example of nature taking back what was once in the forest. So. You can see another sign there. Stop, take a couple pictures. Not that I don't have enough pictures, it's that I don't have any pictures of today. It's always a new day. You can see a couple of corner posts up here. See the beam here. So it gives you an idea as to how large the houses were. We walked right by a beam. There's another center beam here, and there's another beam across there. So it gives you an idea how large the houses were.
This would have all been one house.
One house, one family living here.
So the center, standing in the center, and over here.
Kind of nice how the vegetation's just even staying outside of the oyster shells. But so this house was a little bit different. If you look over here, you'll see this really nice fluted top on here. When we did the dendrochronology and core sampling, I can tell you that that post dates back 1880. It looks a lot newer than that, but it goes back 1880. And this house here, you can see the post is lower at the back than the one in the front there. So this house here is actually one of the houses that had the shed style roof, so it was higher in front, lower in the back. This is also the house where the two welcome figures came from. And the difference between this house is they didn't just have one beam in front and one beam in the back. They actually had two beams in front, and I think that was to help hold up those two 40-foot welcome figures that were once standing here.
Right, you can see that in the picture you showed us.
Yes.
Of the original welcome figures.
Yeah. We pretty much closed off this place to the public. We only allow guided tours. One of the reasons is that if you come close up here, I'm going past the oyster shells. But you could see somebody had tried to draw an outline of a face and some eyes in there. And so people carving on these old posts, that's what we did not want to see happen. So that's basically one of the reasons why we've closed it off to the public. You can see a lot of these nursing trees that are growing on top of these old beams. And you see what I mean by the size of the beams that they would have lifted up, because this beam would have been on top of this post and on top of the one in front. So it's quite an amazing structure. And see how they would have needed a lot of manpower to lift these things. Yeah. So we're going to go take a walk to another part of the house. You got a view of the archway here. So we are standing in the house that belongs to our Tai, our hereditary chief, our Tai Hatwia Kiixin, which is the family where I come from. So welcome to our home. I like to say that. We have genealogy here for 11 generations, and we're very lucky because I think a lot of people, they're lucky to know their grandparents, great-grandparents. But for some, they don't know too much more past that, so we're very fortunate to be able to say that we have genealogy for that long. This house here is a little bit different. The way this house was structured, I mentioned how there were two style houses where they had the peak style roof and the shed style roof. Well, this one was more asymmetrical. It had one peak that was a little bit lower than the other, so one side was short and one was longer. And it's just like when you're looking at the handle of the Big Dipper. So the 3 points on the handle you could see, and that's exactly the same way they designed the roof on this house. And the 3 stars on the Big Dipper are the same as the 3 stars that are important to us. We look at them as the star of yesterday that reminds us of our elders. The star of today is who we are today, and the star of tomorrow is the children, because they're the future. So yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so that's what we relate the 3 stars on the handle of the Big Dipper to. So I think that's pretty cool, pretty interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Stella. Look at how the arch is now, it's a nurse arch. There's so much other vegetation that is making itself home here.
We brought some grade 5 students out here the other year, and we said that this is the doorway to the longhouse, and they said, how big were your people? So they were pretty impressed. There was actually a board like similar to these two that would have been in the middle, so it would have had I don't know what it was, like one side for going in, one side for going out kind of thing. But yeah, it was quite the massive structure that they built.
And the rest of the house is sort of overgrown now. But that was a choice by the nation to let it grow over, wasn't it?
Yes. Parks Canada, when we talked about the designation of a National Historic Site, they had asked us if we wanted to preserve any of the structures here. And that would have meant, using wood filler, but my Uncle Spencer, our Tai at the time, Kiixin, he said no. He said it would take away from its natural look, to have this funny putty filled in, so it wouldn't look the same. And so we decided that one day this arch is going to fall, and so it's going to go back to the earth, and that's exactly what we want. We have enough photos and documentation about how the arch was, so we could always do like a photo sign type thing to share with people to let them know. Yeah. Okay, so now we're in another part of the site, another traditional longhouse. You can actually see this post here. It's actually got a flared top on it, so it's like a knobby top on it. When you walk this way, you'll be able to see the flared top. But so that post is a little bit different than the one at the back, just like that last house that we seen. This one here, you can still see the beam still standing. And that's because we're one of the few First Nations that actually still have an intact village. So all 8 houses are still side by side. There are a lot of the woods deteriorating on the ground, but if we cleared all the vegetation, you would still see each layout of the house. And a lot of First Nations, where they lived in their traditional villages with their traditional homes, they had the opportunity of having a more modern home. So with running water and a kitchen sink and a bathroom. And so they went from having traditional homes to more modern homes. And a lot of them, they either burnt down their traditional longhouses and rebuilt a new modern home, or else they just disintegrated over time, or they just ended up deteriorating. But this place here, because it was left, I think the last people that occupied here was around 1905, somewhere around there. And so this place was pretty much preserved by nature, and so that's why we still have remnants here. And so this beam is actually still standing, and we're going to walk to the back here, and you're actually going to see the post at the back there. It was one big post, and they split it in half, so they used half over there and they used half over there. And so you'll be able to see the difference. And this house was actually the house where a whaling chief lived. And the way we know that is because there's whale bones out at the back there, and we're going to take a walk back there and you can see them. So we'll go for a walk this way. When we get over here, you'll see what I mean by half a post.
Oh yeah, it's totally cut in half. Half a tree.
And when we walk over here, we're actually stepping on roots on top of from this tree that's grown on top of a beam. So we're actually not harming the beam itself. You can see the other half of post right beside me here.
Yeah, this is the other half. Other half tree.
Maybe you do a quick round that way.
And here's from the back of the house.
And so on the ground over here too, we actually have one little beam that's deteriorating, so you have to kind of step over it. And when you're walking in between the houses, you're going to notice there's a mound in between. It's like their compost pile, so it's like where they threw their shellfish and fish bones. And so that's all that is. It's just a big compost pile in between the two houses.
This is the little beam that we have to step over.
And right over here is where we have the whale bones. It's very hard to tell.
It doesn't look like a whale bone.
No. Yeah. But if you flip them over, you can see.
Wow. Cool.
I'm not sure what kind of whale it would be. The archaeologist said could have been a right whale, minke whale, and maybe a humpback. They said the gray whales are they the faster ones, Kelly?
I think
Humpback
are probably the faster ones.
So maybe it was a humpback. It was a little harder to get. But yeah, and hard to say how old those bones are because they've been here for a really long time.
It's really interesting how you can't even tell they're there until you
They
flip
just look
them
like
over.
pieces of wood.
Yeah, wood or covered in moss.
And then we're going to walk this way, and there's you can see a beam still standing, but I want to show you a piece of whalebone that we have hidden in the bush here. It's been sitting in there for a long time.
And this is a really old house post, right?
Yes. When we did the dendrochronology, we couldn't even do a core sample in this because it was so rotten, so we weren't able to. But so this here is a whalebone that you can see was cut. You can see this cut on both sides.
Yeah.
And the length of that, how wide, they think maybe they were possibly going to flatten it and turn it into a halibut fishing hook.
Wow.
Yeah, because they used a lot of bone for a lot of their tools, right?
The cut is so even too. I mean, it looks like power tools did that. Yeah. But it's not.
Yeah, skill.
Yeah.
Some type of saw. I don't know what they would have used. Yeah, you can see the cut there too, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But yeah, this thing just kind of lives under here. Not too many people get to see that.
There you go. You get a special tour from Stella here
so
today.
So that's pretty much the end of our tour. You just walk along the path here. You'll see there's a set of stairs that we go down. You might want to film just the view from up there.
Sure, it's a good view. So let's finish off with you guys getting to see the view.
And the log that's on the left side here is actually a beam, but it's so old that we couldn't even date that one either.
Couldn't date this one.
Oh, the other overgrown in here.
It's a little overgrown.
Yeah.
This is what happens when we don't get to run the regular tours. Oh my goodness.
I know. Look at this.
Watch out for that plant. That's the
my arm.
phototoxic one. We made it.
Stairs.
And there's the beach. Wow.
That ever overgrown.
Amazing.
So I wanted to just mention over here, you can see the spot where it kind of goes out. There, on a super low tide, if you look straight out here, you could actually see a path where there's no boulders. All the boulders have been pushed aside. And so it's like what they call a canoe run, and that's actually where they would paddle up there. It's like the path for their canoes, so they're not hitting any rocks underneath or any boulders. And so the canoe run would be here. And so they would all line up all their canoes all over the beach here. I really wish you guys were here. You missed out on a beautiful day.
They're getting to see it now. The sun's out.
I'm glad Kelly was here to do this with me.
Yeah, I'm glad that you were here to share your stories with us. Thank you, Stella.